Sai Ram. Thank you all for joining the Choose Your Own sessions. Our first speaker today is Uncle Rajat Gyaneshwar. He is a retired professor of obstetrics and gynecology. He was the past president of the Sri Sathya Sai International Organization of Fiji. Currently residing in Fiji, he was the pivotal member and founder of the Visesi Sai Health Centre. He is an inspiration to many young adults, especially in healthcare. One of his favorite quotes is, "The more I learn, the more I discover. I know very little." I'll now hand you over to Uncle Rajat. Sai Ram.
Om Sai Ram. Let us pray. Om Sai Ishwaraya Vidmahe Satya Devaya Dhimahi Tanna Sarva Prachodayat. We realize that Satya Sai is divinity personified. We meditate on this God of truth. We pray that this all-in-all divinity will lead us on the path of liberation. The Sai Gayatri was revealed to Shastri Subramanya, and he presented this to Swami on the 24th of December, 1974. Shastriji was a renowned Vedic scholar, and what the Sai Gayatri does is it tells us who Swami is and what our relationship to Swami is. We're indeed very fortunate to be born at the same time as Swami's discourses, darshans, were available to us. And for many of us, he's our guide on this path to liberation. Today's topic is about building resilience in the self, in the family, and in the community. The concept of resilience is quite interesting. It is perhaps about coping when the chips are down. It is about dealing with adversity without becoming despondent and without becoming too desperate. When one thinks about resilience, there's certain words that one can think about. It's being tough. It's being able to recover. So a good small example might be that if somebody criticizes you, does that get you down? Or can you cope with the criticism and recover from it quickly? It's about developing some level of autonomy so that you can actually deal with situations without being reliant on other people. It is about being adaptable. Things will not always be served to you on a platter. And in fact, when you think that everything is right, things will go wrong. So which of us would have thought that this COVID pandemic would have stilled the world and reduced us to a level of isolation that we did not know about? And it's adapting to that makes us resilient. Resilience is also about being pragmatic. You've got to understand and sometimes go with the flow when things aren't quite right. But at the same time, you need to maintain certain rules. Another thought about resilience is having endurance. Swami talks about life being a game, play it, but go the long haul and don't get discouraged and don't step out of the game. Education is all about building resilience in the individual, but the concentration there is about mental, physical, and social resilience. And in the secular education system, there are a series of disciplines that you have to follow so that you can build that resilience. And the discipline includes time management, it includes managing your mind, it includes dealing with people around you. Swami introduces yet another dimension to building resilience, and that is the capacity to develop spiritually. And spiritual resilience is about maintaining your faith in the divine, even when things aren't going well. And when we think about spiritual resilience, what better stories can one recount but the story of Krishna and Arjuna, so beautifully depicted by Swami in the Gita Vaini. There was the scion of warriors in despair because he was going to have to kill his relatives. And it took Krishna effort to remind Arjuna that this body is not the reality, that the truth is that we're all part of that one universe, universal Atma. And that when we become body attached and body conscious, then we start thinking about things that are unreal. The other story about resilience is in the Ram Katha Raswani. And here, imagine Ram getting ready for his coronation and then suddenly being told, you're not going to be crowned. You have to go into the forests for 14 years of banishment. Ram remains in total equanimity. He wasn't terribly elated at the fact that he was being crowned. He's not terribly despondent now that he knows that he won't be crowned and that he will be banished. The theme for the World Conference is Unity is Divinity and Purity is Enlightenment. So let us see where resilience fits into this. Swami often talked about people going to him saying, I want peace. And Swami's response would be, remove the I, remove the want, and you have peace left. And in fact, this, like all of Swami's saying, is a very significant, deep message. In his discourse in 2006, Swami talks about sadhana. Sadhana is our spiritual journey and our spiritual discipline and practice. And what Swami says is that in your sadhana, you must have complete faith. There should be no room for doubt. If you have doubt, then your sadhana is not going to work well. Swami also says, get rid of your attachment and aversions. Swami tells us that there are three great enemies to our detachment. One is desire, which destroys devotion. The second is anger, which he says annihilates wisdom. And the third is greed, which poisons every action and even business. The only way to get rid of these three enemies, Swami says, is to burn them in the fire of divine love. So in building resilience, the message from Swami is that you must have a faith in your sadhana, and you must recognize what weaknesses will lead you to despondency. Now let's talk about love. When he says consume your enemies in the fire of divine love is what we're all searching for. Loving your own parents, loving your siblings is easy. Loving your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife is easy. But that is a love that includes attachment. And it is that attachment that causes us the pain. And I don't have to tell any one of you that when one's love life is not running well, one is terribly despondent, and one quite often be in severe grief. This divine love that Swami is talking about is unconditional love. And it is a love that is consistent, constant, and present forever. How do we understand this divine love? Swami has said, my life is my message. Swami is Satya, he is Prema, he is Dharma, he is Ahimsa, and he's always in bliss. He set up this organization for us so that we can find the divinity in us. And he's also told us on many occasions not to be attached to this body, because attachment and desire are both ego-driven. And that's why he said, if you want peace, get rid of the I and get rid of the want. Now, what is this Atmic principle? In the Katho Upanishad, it says, smaller than the smallest, greater than the greatest, this self forever dwells within the hearts of all. When a man is free from desire, his mind and senses purified, he beholds the glory of the self, and is without sorrow, all-pervading and supreme. In self, the wise man, knowing his true being, traverses all grief. Swami tells us that we must have faith. So what is this faith? What do we mean by faith? St. Augustine describes faith in this way. He says faith is believing in what you cannot see. And the reward of this faith is that you begin to see what you believe in. Faith is a powerful source of energy. It is a secret power in our mind which allows us to be resilient when we're in trouble, because it teaches us to trust. Seema Dewan, who's written about messages that she has received from Swami, has written this: faith will not stop the boat of life from rocking. These are Swami's words. No. That what you must face will come, but faith will stop you from falling from the rocking boat. It gives you strength to balance the boat, to stop it from overturning. Another sailing parlance is that if you have to ride a storm, the resilient sailor will batten down the hatches and have a sleep. And when he wakes up, the storm would have passed and he would have survived. Fighting that storm on the top of the boat with big waves coming would be a disastrous step to take. Faith and truth go hand in hand. If the mind is in control, then you can't have faith, because you're constantly doubting. And that doubting is created because the ego, the mind, feeds the ego with uncertainties and puts doubts. An example. I'm now retired. Do I have enough funds to make sure that I can survive my retirement? Will I be able to pay my bills? Or do I need to find a job and make sure that I've got some steady income? The mind plays tricks. And unless I control the mind with some data and facts, that mind is going to create problems for me. So, faith in my superannuation, faith in my savings should be there, with a firm conviction. Otherwise, I would be forever chasing my efforts to keep secure. At this stage, I'd just like to read something that Swaran wrote. I mean, there is a lot I've learned from my wife, and Swami says that W in wife stands for wisdom. On the 26th of February 2020, she wrote, Om Sai Ram, dearest beloved Baba, you know all, but I need to document. On our way to Suva for the research meeting, we were discussing you, your love, your majesty, your grace, your omnipotence, you, the Akhand Parabrahma, our absolute privilege and blessing to have been born when you chose to take physical birth as the Avatar, the Sai Avatar, the Shiva Shakti, the one in all, the all in one. She goes on, there was some rain, some sunshine. Suddenly we saw a beautiful rainbow in the distance, which is not unusual given the situation. But love welled up and was overflowing, seeing the cosmic beauty. Suddenly, the end of the rainbow was beside us on the left side of the road, with the glory of all the colors. It moved with the car from the green trees. It was over the car and onto the grass on the road. Oh, what a sight, glorious, beautiful colors. To see the end of the rainbow, and right beside us was something never expected. Thank you, my Lord. We love you. So when St. Augustine talks about faith beginning to allow you to see things that you believe in, this is perhaps a small example. And I'm sure all of you have examples where faith has allowed you to see divinity around you. What else goes with faith? Swami talks about surrender. He talks about surrender to him so that we have no worries. Swami tells us a story about Professor Gorkuk. Professor Gorkuk was the Vice Chancellor of the Sai University. He used to sit on the veranda at Swami's feet and had a series of questions every time he was there. Then one fine day, Swami turned to him and said, any questions? And Gorkuk said, no more questions. And that is surrender. When you have no more questions of why Swami is doing things, why he's not doing things, because what you're saying is, thy will be done, whatever it is. I'm going to be able to go. Swami's also said, why get agitated? Let me take care of your business. I intervene only when you surrender completely. Why fear when I'm here? To surrender means to turn all your thoughts from your problem. Thy will be done. Sometimes you feel that disasters increase instead of diminish, and one disaster follows another. Don't get agitated. Call me with full faith. Thy will be done, and I will come. Let me tell you another story. We had been going to Prashanti for some 17 years, but never got called by Swami. And this was quite disappointing. In 2010, in March, April, I had a conference to attend in Nepal. So I contacted Lakshmi Narayana, who is in charge of the hospitals in Parthi, to say that I would visit Parthi and spend some time at the hospitals if he wished. And he responded very welcomingly and said, come. And then 2 days before I was to go, he rings me and says, don't come because Swami is not going to be here. Swami has gone to Delhi and for a trip up north. So I was in a quandary. But then I said, thy will be done. Swami, I promised Mr. Lakshmi Narayana that I'll go to Parthi. Even if you're not there, I will go. I went to Parthi. And interestingly enough, as I was having a nap after doing some work at the hospital, suddenly the bhajan music started. And I was a little bewildered. I went out to see what was happening, and I saw a few people running towards Mandir. Parthi did not have a large crowd at that time because Swami was not supposed to be there. So I run up to somebody and say, "What's happening?" "Swami's back." So I run up and I get sent to the veranda. Swami comes, not many people are there, and he says, "So what I'm saying is, if you have faith, and if you have commitment, and you have patience, things will happen." Surrender, in a sense, is letting go of your hang-ups. So we have discussed faith, and we've discussed surrender. What else is required in the development of resilience? Right conduct. Now, how does right conduct build up resilience? Right conduct, together with discipline, means that you develop a commitment to do your very best so that you can share love with actions that are based on unity, making people secure and giving them happiness. It's about promoting nonviolence. It's about engendering trust and peace. The enemies of right conduct are desire, anger, greed, jealousy. All these are ego-driven and based on attachment. So once again, destroy the I, destroy the want, and you have peace. Right action leads to knowledge, which purifies the mind to recognize the truth. So what you're really doing is, when you're talking about unity and divinity, sometimes it's difficult for us to realize this, because the biggest doubt that our mind tells us is, you're human, how can you be divine? And in fact, in discussions with non-Sai members, quite often you will hear about the duality as God being quite separate and you being quite separate. This is a different story to that Atmic principle, which is that all of us are united in divinity, that we are all part of that divinity, and that this body is only a transient residence and will go. It ages, it diseases, it decays, it dies. But the Atma remains untouched, unblemished, as the Kathopanishad said, and that I quoted at the beginning. Smaller than the smallest, bigger than the biggest. This self exists. So it's not a matter of arrogance or anything like that in calling ourselves divine. It is understanding the truth. So the linkage between unity and divinity and purity is enlightenment, is that if you're pure in your thought, word, and deed, and if your actions are driven by love, then you're going to understand the truth about your divinity. But if you're tarnished in your purity, then enlightenment is a lot more difficult. The chief occupation of wisdom for us is to contemplate on the truth. And in contemplating on the truth, believe in yourself, stick to your faith, surrender to the Almighty. Right conduct is being loving, live with compassion and forbearance. How do you build this resilience in the family? Swami tells a beautiful story about Mahatma Gandhi and his mother Putlibai. Putlibai spent a lot of time talking to young Gandhi about who he was and about this Atmic principle. And this little man, wearing only a loincloth, took on the vastness of the British Empire and defeated them in the cause of freedom through non-violence, but by truth. And what is more interesting about Gandhiji is that even though he died being shot, his last words were "He Ram, He Ram." And this is resilience. And this is what you can get by having this faith. So the family is a very important place to develop resilience. And I think Swami, with his SSE classes and human values education, lays emphasis on the fact that if we're going to have a resilient family that is going to be able to cope with adversities, then that family needs to be grounded on these values. What do Swarna and I do when we're challenged? We revert to saying prayers. And we pray together, even though she's in Sydney at the moment and I'm in Fiji. Every morning for an hour, we chant the Gayatri. And that gives us strength, and that gives us resilience to cope with things with equanimity. Because the monkey mind is consistently there to trap you. And to control the mind, Swami has given us many prescriptions. Apart from chanting the Gayatri, singing bhajans, reading Swami's writings, listening to Swami's discourses, and satsang are all very powerful ways of building resilience, not only within the family, but within a wider community. So I think the basic principles that Swami has talked about with resilience is there for us to build on at the level of the family and at the level of the community. Swami, in one of his discourses, said that it is our mind that perceives pain, and it is our mind that perceives pleasure. So what is pain for one person might be pleasure for another person. It is the way the mind thinks. The mind should be our servant, not our master. And much of human values education program is directed, and SSE classes is directed at controlling this mind and making sure that we understand who we really are. Swami has said that to realize who we are and to learn about this divine love, selfless service is important. And I know many of us can be very busy, but what selfless service does is it helps you get rid of your ego. And once it gets rid of your ego and makes you understand that all of us are the same in our divinity, we learn about unity in the community and in the family. And recognizing that emancipates us and makes us more resilient in coping with things. Life is a step ladder on the way to divinity. Some might say it's like snakes and ladders. Sometimes your trip up the ladder is hastened. Other times you get grabbed by a snake and you go back down to start again. The important thing about life is to learn from the mistakes. Remember that nothing is good and nothing is bad, provided you follow certain principles. But remember also that all of us are vulnerable. I've had a fairly difficult week, and one of the things that the Bhajagovindam in one of its last stanzas talks about is that even the elderly who should be wise quite often forget who they are, and they become angry, and they fall into the same traps of mind games. My mind game was that when my license expires, I now have to have a driver's test. And I felt a bit aggrieved about this, because I got my driving license when I was 17, and I've driven without any major accidents which were due to my fault. I'm a safe driver, and yet I needed to have a driver's license. I'd had my medical test done, so I thought, if I've got my medical test, why a driving test? So I was annoyed. And I must have shown my annoyance, because the man handling me said, "How's your heart?" And I said, "My heart's good." And then he said, "Sorry about all this, but this is the law." And Swami has said, follow the country's laws. Why does the law exist? The law exists because older drivers may have slower reflexes, may not see as well, may not hear as well, and therefore the safety of others might be an issue. So my ego needed to be controlled, even though I had a lapse. So one of the good things about preparing for this talk has been that it's probably been more rewarding for me in the preparation of the talk than for you in the listening of it. Because as with Swami's teachings, the deeper you get into it, the more frequently you read his teachings, the more frequently you reflect about that, the more resilient you become. And in that resilience, you then start removing stresses from your mind. You are generally happy, and hopefully you can achieve bliss. Sai-Ram. I'd just like to close by saying the Gayatri. Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Diyo Yana Prachodayat. When preparing for this talk, I looked at my diary from 2007. In 2007, every day, I used to write in my diary and reflect on the thought for the day. In that diary, I found that we had visited Sharda Math in Calcutta. And at the Sharda Math in Calcutta, this is the Ramakrishna Mission Math, there was a transliteration of the Gayatri. And their take was, ever protecting Almighty, supreme love, destroyer of suffering, protector of happiness, you the controller of the universe, the doer of all actions, the embodiment of truth, let us meditate so that our thoughts, words, and deeds are dedicated to good. Sai-Ram.
Thank you, Uncle, for the insightful sharing on how to build resilient individuals, families, and communities. You very practically took us through the concept of building spiritual resilience through sadhana. You reminded us about the path to peace, that is to remove the I and the want, which is the three great enemies of detachment: desire, anger, and greed. You lovingly shared the letter by your wife and your story with Swami to emphasize the importance of unshakable faith and surrender that is needed to be resilient. You highlighted the importance of human values and spiritual practices to nurture resilience in the family. And you finally shared that selfless service is the key principle that Swami has taught us to develop resilience in the community. Thank you, Uncle, for your wisdom that you have shared with us. We now have a few questions for you. The first one is, can you please explain if there is a difference between being resilient and avoiding conflict?
Sairam, thank you very much, Nathia, for asking these questions, and thank you for the opportunity of sharing some thoughts. These thoughts really have gelled from Swami's discourses and reading Swami's writings and listening to his discourses. We're indeed very fortunate to be in Swami's fold and to have him guide us. Your question is there a difference between resilience and conflict? Am I right in? Right. So I think conflict is a slightly different concept. Resilience is the ability to deal with whatever situation we're in a practical way without it getting us down. And when I say without getting us down, I mean there needs to be no resentment, there needs to be no anger, there must be no sense of fear. So what I'm really saying is that just as a little child falls, it stands up and is ready to have another fall until such time as it can start walking. That child has no real conflict about having to walk. The issue basically is that the challenge is to be able to walk, and the child is going to persevere and in it show resilience in taking up the challenge of working. Conflict, on the other hand, is can be a negative thing. But if I can understand where your question is coming from, sometimes conflict can lead us into feeling as if we're being defeated. Conflict, I think, on the other hand, can be taken in a positive sense, in that it's a challenge on your path of whatever it is that you're doing. It may be your sadhana. And I think many great devotees have had occasions of serious conflict. Mother Teresa had many dark moments when she, in fact, asked whether God really loved her. And indeed, she asked whether God existed. These were her dark moments, and dark moments are part of that spiritual journey. And when the dark moment comes, we need to have a sense of faith and a sense of patience, because Swami has said that when we are lost and when we are conflicted in our minds, then he is happy to carry us. And I think you remember that talk that he gave where you can see footsteps following Swami, and then suddenly there are no footsteps. And when the devotee asks why there are no footsteps, Swami says, because I'm carrying you. And when I carry you, you're part of me. So I don't know whether that answers your question about the difference between conflict and resilience. I'm happy to take a secondary question if you wish.
Thank you, Uncle, for the very practical examples. For the next question, can you please share a personal example of when you chose to demonstrate resilience, and what was the outcome?
Let me share two examples. One was when I was in the last year of high school. I realized that the university course that I wanted to do would require physics. and we had a very difficult physics teacher, and I was barely able to pass the subject. And I thought, how would I deal with the situation? Until it occurred to me that maybe I should see if there was tuition available elsewhere. And the only tuition that was available to me was through correspondence course from New Zealand. So I enrolled in the correspondence course in physics, and from coming last in class, by the end of second term, I was topping the class in physics and did fairly well. What I think this shows is you need to have pragmatic approaches to dealing with resilience. Resilience doesn't just come out of the blue. You have to find solutions to problems that exist. Another example is when I had finished my postgraduate training in Sydney, I wanted to subspecialize, but there was no opportunity in the subspecialty that I was interested in. So I offered to work for 6 months pro bono. And this was a real challenge because suddenly there was going to be no salary and the family had to be looked after. But there was a strong sense of trust and faith that things would work out. And certainly after the 6 months, things worked out brilliantly. And I succeeded in many ways through that lesson of accepting the challenge and finding a creative solution, which was working for no money for 6 months.
Thank you, Uncle. And one final question.
Yes.
How do you maintain resilience in a challenging work environment?
I think that's an excellent question because all of us in the work environment feel very challenged, and in recent times there has always been issues of bullying and harassment in the workplace in the severest sense. And then there is a whole spectrum where criticisms from superiors come frequently in certain environments. I think this is probably a issue of perception on the part of the recipient of the criticism. If the criticism is positive and it is applicable because you need to improve in a certain area, then one should say thank you for the criticism and improve. On the other hand, if the criticism is misguided and misdirected, then it should be like water off a duck's back. But in dealing with this issue of challenging workplace environment, one needs to be measuring oneself against certain criteria. So what Swami is advising us in this situation is that it is important for us to realize who we really are. And if we realize who we really are, we have a sense of self-confidence and we have a sense of self-worth. We're aware that we are, in fact, above criticism. And in a sense, we are almost untouchable from negativities. But our mindset needs to be positive in this area. Of course, in a reality, in a real situation, there will be circumstances where the workplace is so challenging that it's not worth persisting with it. I don't think it is showing a lack of resilience if you decide that you need to move on and do something else. In fact, you need to be thinking of the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is really the issue of enjoying what you're doing and making sure that you're making a contribution. Work, in a sense, Swami has said, is also part of one's sadhana. Work is not separate from one's spiritual development. if work becomes part of one's spiritual development, then one's perception regarding the challenges that one faces changes. And from it being a negative experience, it can become a very positive experience. And it may even be that you, in a small way, can make a difference to the whole organization by being positive in an environment which is highly critical. Quite often, the people who are criticizing you are in fact expressing their own sensitivities and insecurities. And you need to be aware of that. And if you are compassionate, then you will be able to spread your love in an environment that could otherwise be seen as antagonistic. Swami has talked about Kshama as being a very powerful spiritual attribute. And when one thinks about Kshama, it is forbearance, and forbearance in the way that was shown by people like Mahatma Gandhi, by Nelson Mandela, who in spite of being imprisoned, who in spite of being treated very badly, never lost a belief in themselves, never lost their compassionate selves, never lost a focus in the long-term goals that they had, which was value-driven. I understand Nelson Mandela, when he came out of prison and became president, one of the first things he did was invited his captors for afternoon tea and had a pleasant evening with them instead of being resentful, angry, and showing all those negative values. So I think in the workplace environment, one needs to be realistic. Sometimes you need to move a lot on, and that is showing resilience because the place is too hostile and too difficult to deal with. But if you can make a difference to the environment that you're in, then that is a very valuable exercise in developing your own sadhana and sharing your love and compassion with the wider community. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Uncle. Those are excellent practical examples. Once again, we would like to thank you for your time and wisdom, for sharing your practical experiences on developing resilience in our daily life. Om Sai Ram.
Sai Ram. What I want to say at the finish is that one of the great things that our sadhana provides us is a discovery of Swami's very practical teachings on day-to-day living. In fact, almost every challenge that one faces, there is an answer that Swami has somewhere. And all you have to do is pick up Satya Sai Speaks or turn on to any of his discourses, and without a doubt, there will be a sentence or a paragraph which answers your current issues and concerns and conflicts. So it is Swami who gives the practical guidance. We're just the messengers who are learning to put his teachings into practice. Sai Ram.